There's a good chance you're going to live into your 80s or 90s. Will you have enough money to enjoy your retirement? I'm Erik Brenner. Some tips to keep the money flowing while you're still going. Next on Your Wealth Health. Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Wealth Health. I'm Erik Brenner, owner of Hilltop Wealth Solutions. And if you're watching us on Facebook, please share us with someone who could use this information. And thanks for watching us on yourwealthhealth.com. With me today, I have Bill Davis and Matt Arens. Bill is joining me in the studio here. We're continuing to practice social distancing, and Matt is from his home office in Valparaiso, Indiana. So to both of you, thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about planning for a longer life. Today we want to talk about the changing face of retirement and really the biggest changes in longevity. People are just living so much longer these days, and that means you must plan for a longer life. We're dedicating 2 weeks of shows to this issue. Today we're going to talk about healthcare and estate planning, and then next week we're going to examine the market risk and policy risk associated with living a longer life. So people are really enjoying retirement. So let's go ahead and take a look at the screen. You know, Bill, I mean, the first video we have here is someone running in the morning, right? Just enjoying their retirement.
I mean, you just look at that and, we're finding that our clients are more and more active. They're taking on new things, like we have a clip there of swimming. I have a lot of clients that love to go to the YMCA. And
I'm sure you do too, Bill, right? First thing in the morning.
I do. I do it in my lake. Horseback riding is pretty popular, and, just being outdoors and enjoying a different lifestyle when they don't have to go to work anymore. And then the physical activity is something else, as far as people going to gyms now that they're opening up. And, we have a couple that's, practicing some boxing moves and stuff. So
didn't get enough jabs during their working career, right? So they got to get a bunch of jabs.
Yeah, right.
In.
I guess so. But but just people are just more and more active, which is contributing to this longevity that we think is a retirement risk.
Yeah. Matt, and we have said that the 70 is the new 60 and the 80 is the new 70. They're taking better care of themselves and they're just living longer. And so when you're talking about retirement planning, we really need to consider that, don't we?
Yeah, you're exactly right. To your guys' point about running, I think of just over the weekend out at the Indiana Dunes running on some trails, and there's a lot of groups of people in their 60 plus running out there, staying active. And we're seeing, if you take a look at the graphic, we're seeing, 1970, the average life expectancy for somebody was around 70 years old. And in 2020, that's been pushed out to about 79. So just exactly to your guys' points, that is increasing. It's getting pushed out. People are living longer because of healthy lifestyles, better eating, and medical advancements.
And we have a tool at Hilltop Wealth Solutions, and there's a lot of tools out there now that you can put in some information and really help determine maybe where your life expectancy will fall. Of course, no one knows for sure, but if you take a look at the graphic here, Bill, we took a 61 and a 58 or 59-year-old and put in some information where they had a fairly healthy background. Their family history was fairly healthy, and I think people would be surprised to look and see the chances of living well into their 80s.
Yeah, this is a really busy graph, I know, but it's also important to realize that, especially if you look at the non-smoker that's age 61 and 59, 50% chance to live to 93. So if somebody's retiring at 63, that's 30 years of retirement. And so, even somebody that, is still a smoker, they're looking at an 50% chance to live to 86. And if you look at the 30% odds of both of them living to 87, that's a lot of people that are going to live a lot longer than they ever expected. And I know we've talked about this, that many of our clients say, "Oh, I'm not going to live that long. Forget it. I don't care if I run out of money because I'm not going to live that long." But in fact, it's proving true, and odds are getting better and better that people are going to have an extended life expectancy.
Yeah, and I think it's, as you said, and we educate folks all the time in a lot of what we do, that it's just it's different now than it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And this kind of shows that, you did that long retirement. So, selection of Social Security, making sure that your investments are properly diversified, all that's going to be really important.
That's right.
Yeah, so we have some recent study from the Center of Retirement Research at Boston College, and it talks, Matt, about the things that, it says the longevity really is the number one threat for their retirement.
Right. Longevity being number one, market risk being number two, health risk, family risk, and policy risk. And I think to Bill's point, longevity is a really big one, especially, Bill made the point when you hear people say, well, in my family, most people don't live past, so and such date. And I think that's a really difficult spot sometimes for us to be in because, as a fiduciary, you have to kind of put that to the side and say, well, if you want to plan to age 83, we can. But what happens if we get to that date and you run out of money and we're just looking at each other from across the table? That's not going to be a good place to be. And so we have that responsibility to say that might be the case in your family history. We just can't plan for that. We have to plan for that longevity because we've seen people push past. I mean, Bill, I think you're the home run hero here with 5 or 6 clients over the age of 100. So, that's a long time for us to be planning in the future. And to your point, Erik, that just makes Social Security decisions paramount. You have to make that decision, especially when you look at 1970, age 70 being the longevity. We're talking about making decisions, starting Social Security at age 70 these days. So, I'm with you 100%, Erik. There's a lot of risks. And I think this Center for Boston College is hammering these right on the head.
Yeah, so, we at a Hilltop, we take that holistic approach with folks, and, we do have situations right now and clients right now that are spending more in their later 80s than they did even when they first retired just because of the healthcare costs. So let's talk about some of the factors, Bill, that comes into play when we're thinking about the planning for the new retirement.
Well, yeah, I mean, it becomes complex, right? I mean, we want our clients to manage their health, and many are doing a good job of that. We have to manage the withdrawal rate. We have to manage the risk that we're taking, so the risk-adjusted return, take into account inflation. A lot of people, the government, Federal Reserve is managing to, basically 2% inflation. But when you start breaking down the costs that clients have in retirement, like health care, it is inflating at a greater rate than what the government tells us the general inflation rate is. And so, and then, families are moving further away from each other, so that can cause challenges for our elderly clients getting assistance from their family because they live in diverse geographic areas now. And then the pandemic has certainly caused us some challenges with people being able to travel and people being able to visit and help, and all of that's causing a challenge too.
Yeah, and we mentioned here on that graphic I talked about work plans. We're seeing with technology and stuff, a lot of people retiring and then in their career or where they have experience, they can do some consulting work, and that can kind of factor in as well.
That's right.
So it makes a difference there. Well, healthcare, of course, is one of the biggest costs that we've talked about before. And when we come back on Your Wealth Health, we're going to talk about that, and we'll examine some specific healthcare strategies. But also, we want to get the answer to this question. How much money will a couple in their mid-60s who are planning to retire this year spend on healthcare during their retirement? Is it $420,000, $295,000, $157,000, or $219,000? Stay with us. We'll have that answer and much more right here on Your Wealth Health.
Hey everybody, this is Ken Steve from K's Cleaning. If you're dirty, we come in a hurry. As summer begins to wind down, you got the fall coming up. One of the most important things is keeping your house clean, disinfected, especially if you got kids. Dealing with children having the e-learning, kids are around the house more, you have to do more cleaning, you have to keep more germs down. What better way to get it done than to go on and hire us to do that for you? so you'll have more time in a day. So the number's right here on the screen. You can contact us by the number or by Facebook. If you need more time in your day, try K's Way.
Built on a legacy 4 generations strong. Clayton Hoover & Sons Home Improvement. More than just our business, it's a family legacy.
Welcome back to Your Wealth Health. I'm Erik Brenner along with Bill Davis and Matt Oren. Guys, we had a trivia question before the break. How much money will the average couple in their mid-60s who are planning to retire this year spend on healthcare during their retirement? And the answer would be $295,000. So, with healthcare being the most, the most expensive thing they spend on retirement, what are some things people can do to help ease that burden? I know Medicare's there, but sometimes that becomes a bit confusing. What are the things that they can do?
Well, yeah, I think that's an area that's commonly either misunderstood or overlooked as to how much that's going to be. So, this study was from average, age 65, living to today's life expectancy. So, we're saying that could be a couple $1,000s a month in a couple's retirement income expenses. And so we have to be thinking about where's that money going to come from? And because we know healthcare is inflating at a greater rate than general expenses, we need to plan for that couple $1,000s a month to inflate over time, and then of course the life expectancy is an issue as well. So we're going to have another bucket of savings, potentially utilizing health savings accounts would be a good place to start for a couple.
Yeah, and that's the financial side of it, obviously, and the protection and making sure we have the proper insurance. And Matt, there's other factors that come into play that we see that aren't necessarily financial as well.
Right. I think a lot of it has to do with just even emotional. It can be psychological. It could be being around support and family members. It could be just the lifestyle that you're leading, the dietary, those types of things. But definitely we're seeing more and more people just they kind of spark up when they talk about their kids or their grandkids, and if they're close to them and they're seeing them more often emotionally and psychologically, they're doing a little bit better. And so those are factors that now begin other discussions of relocation and retirement and what's that cost going to look like. And so again, it's a really complex situation that we just continue to try to learn more about to give better advice and to help coach clients through that discussion.
Yeah, and you mentioned the relocation part. The other factors that come into play is where's your family located? Will you have to relocate? And I know we've got kind of several bullet points that we wanted to talk about, Bill, in that area, because it's important to consider as you're putting together this retirement plan.
Well, yeah, and it's even been more difficult during COVID. There's been some studies talking about just mental health concerns with people having to be alone for so long and be shuttered in for so long. I mean, I still have clients, after 5 months that, are still getting their groceries delivered by their kids and all of that. So yeah, depending on where you live geographically, it could be more difficult for people just to get the basic needs provided to them. Yeah.
Yeah, so the other thing about moves and costs associated with moves, whether that's in your current area or moving elsewhere for family. So I know we see a lot of times where a couple retires and they move closer to family, where their kids and grandkids are, and then you hear about some in downsizing. And so Matt, I say all the time to folks that downsizing, as far as size of home, doesn't necessarily mean less money.
That's exactly right, Erik. I think we've had quite a few clients just this year relocate, and last year relocate, and downsizing. If you're going from a 4-bedroom house to a 2-bedroom condo, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be cheaper, especially if you're relocating. If you're moving from here to, let's say, north suburbs of Chicago, it's not going to be a downsizing of cost. Or even if you're moving out west or to some hot pocket bigger cities, metropolitan cities, that's just more expensive. A lot of clients moving to Florida. It's definitely not going to be a cheaper downsize. It might be the same, it might be more, and those are really the things that we're finding people are beginning to plan for a little bit more in advance. They're not waiting as long to make those decisions. They maybe wait just to make sure that their kids are actually going to stay in that spot if they're relocating for family reasons. If they're relocating just to try to acquire some warmer temperatures and a little bit more vitamin D, they're planning that out for sure. But you're exactly right, Eric. Downsizing doesn't mean less expensive.
Yeah, very, very rarely do we find that. And, I've had a couple situations recently of clients moving from, kind of the Midwest, local here, and moving out to the West Coast and, sold their house here where they were established and then moved out to the West Coast. And obviously out in the West Coast, real estate's a lot more.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and they spend double.
Right.
So, we had, and we've had that in their plan. That knowing that they were going to have to do that. So, we found an interesting a graphic to show where the most reasonable, based on a bunch of factors, to live around the country. So we thought we'd share that with our viewing audience, Bill.
If you look at this graphic, it is surprising that the number one state for, I think the data that went into it was cost of living, crime, property prices, life expectancy, and the percentage of the population 60 and over, and Iowa came in number one.
So if you want to move to Iowa, that's the number one there.
That's the number one. I mean, it's got the best cost of living, and people are living longer, so they have healthy lifestyle there. But it's kind of surprising that you have Midwest states like Minnesota, like Nebraska, and Idaho. I heard a lot of people are migrating from the coasts up toward, I think it was Boise, Idaho is one of the top destination spots now. And, the Wyoming's getting up into the mountains and North Dakota. But, Florida's a big one, not only because of climate, but because of the fact that they don't have any state income tax. So some of these states have a lower or no state income tax, which is something to be considered as well.
Yeah, and so, Matt, I know, though, that being said, a lot of people just don't choose it based on a chart and data. They choose it based on family and not really considering the chart and data that, this survey would have provided.
That's exactly right. A lot of them are moving where kids and grandkids are at to be around the family members. And that's going to help, Oftentimes we find that they're moving and they soon retire, and now they're the home daycare. They're taking care of grandkids at the house while their parents are working, and they're helping out with that financial cost for their kids, which allows them to spend quality time with the grandkids. So now their lifestyles become really active. If you're 65, 70 years old and you're taking care of 2 and 4-year-olds, that's a lot of running around, Eric. So that definitely helps with the longevity when you're talking exercise on a daily basis. But you're also talking other healthcare reasons. If you have no family around, you have no kids around, and you're saying, well, who's going to help me with my medical decisions? Who's going to help me with going to doctor's appointments and maintaining my property and upkeep in the yard? Those are big concerns for a lot of people, not just being by family, but it's also how is family going to help support me? And so I think we're seeing a lot of people move for those reasons. And it's a really key factor for people to really look forward on that. I think if you're just reactive, a lot of times people find it difficult to make that move.
Yeah, those are great points, Matt. And because we're living longer, we're often put off tough decisions related to estate planning, which is what you were talking about, Matt. It's human nature to procrastinate. But if you need to have a plan, we'll explain why it's so important when we return on Your Wealth Health.
BNI, or Business Network International, is a huge organization, and today we're in 75 different countries with over 9,000 chapters and 260,000 members, almost 250,000. What it does, it gives a platform for a business owner to generate business for their company. And that's really the sole purpose of BNI. So we would invite you to visit a chapter sometime and see if it works for you. If it doesn't, that's fine. What's the worst thing that can happen? You met 30 people you didn't know before.
Welcome back to Your Wealth Health. I'm Erik Brenner with Bill Davis and Matt Arends, and we've been focused on the impact of people living longer has on retirement planning, and we have to talk about estate planning. It's natural for people to think they can put it off, but that's not a good idea, is it, Bill?
No, I mean, these are matters of importance. We're seeing a lot of this coming into play with the pandemic, especially with the healthcare power of attorney, and the medical professionals need to have approval prior to having someone in the hospital, that somebody outside of the hospital can be consulted on the healthcare decisions, and especially if you have a loved one that's on a ventilator that doesn't have a healthcare power of attorney. That's a really difficult situation. So that would be the number one document in my eyes that needs to be updated. The HIPAA laws are very strict, and the healthcare profession is very strict on not taking any orders without that healthcare power of attorney. So to me, that's number one. You can think about estate planning. You can think about estate planning documents as things that are in play when you're alive, right? And then and that would be power of attorney for financial decisions, healthcare powers of attorney for healthcare decisions.
Yeah, and I think we all the time in discussions with folks, new clients as well as clients that we're working with, we ask them, do you have a estate plan? And the common response is, I have a will. It's pretty old, but I have a will, and it's just bigger than that. So, Matt, as Bill said, these other documents, just kind of listing those out, it is bigger than that, than just a will. And then, of course, it needs to be updated. Laws change.
Right. We traditionally oftentimes will talk to people about a will, living will, power of attorney for finance, power of attorney for healthcare, your HIPAA release. Those are a lot of times the really big ones. Sometimes we can get into things like revocable trusts. Are those needed or not needed? I think another thing that we talked often about is, do you have proper beneficiary designations on your financial accounts? So your banking accounts, retirement plans. We're now even seeing things on property, titles and deeds. Those all need to align and work with each other. And a lot of times we can see people have their will say something, their beneficiaries on retirement plan assets or bank accounts will actually have different ones. And so now those don't align. And what we find is one supersedes another. Your financial power, your designated beneficiaries will supersede your will. So if those aren't working together, it just creates a lot of problems, opening up probate exposure and confusion, especially if you're a beneficiary. Again, those are some simple documents that we think that you really need to have in order. You really need to review them every 3 to 5 years, or if there's a big change in your life, family members die, somebody marries in, you have kids or grandkids. Those are great opportune times to just review your documents and say, do I need to make changes, or is everything still in good order?
Yeah, and the beneficiaries, Matt, that you mentioned, Bill, Matt mentioned it briefly, but we just can't say enough about making sure you got proper beneficiaries, because that supersedes the will. I say that's kind of the ultimate. It bypasses, because oftentimes folks say, well, it's in my will, but beneficiaries is a great way in most cases to pass assets.
Yeah, it's the best way. So that's why we've begun utilizing TOD, transfer on death deeds for property, TODs on investment accounts, payable on death, or PODs for your credit unions and your banks. And so most people believe that the will that they drafted 20 years ago that is going to allow their estate to pass appropriately to the way they want. And Matt makes a very valid point that beneficiary designations on accounts overrides any will. The will's only going to settle things that would be probatable. So that might be their property, their personal property, their collections, their cars and vehicles and things like that. But most everything else is going to transfer via beneficiary designations, PODs, TODs, and so Matt makes a great point. That's the most important thing to do first. And if they haven't checked on those things prior to getting to an attorney to work on these other legal documents, that would be a great starting point for one of our viewers that might be watching today.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to note that beneficiaries is the best way. However, when you have a beneficiary, the money automatically gets passed, so it doesn't say in the estate. So there could be cases that working with your attorney and your advisor where you may want to leave some money in the estate to help settle it, because those beneficiaries get that money, and obviously to go ask them for that money becomes very difficult. So it really breaks it down per specific situation. The other thing to consider, Matt, is the Secure Act. The changes that happened, the biggest retirement legislation in more than 10 years, and that comes into play really more so now than what it did prior to this law change.
You're exactly right, Eric. A lot of I'm even having conversations with clients just last week that were, we were hoping to stretch out an IRA over the beneficiary's lifetime, and now that has to be depleted within 10 years. And so we're going back to the drawing board on, do we name that child as the receiver of that IRA, or do we name it a charitable organization because they have some gifting ideas as well? So you really have to address current laws, and I think that's one of the points that the Boston College report was saying is policy change. So those policy and tax changes happen on a regular basis, and we have to stay aware of that. We have to stay educated on that, and we have to make sure that clients are well aware of those changes. And again, that just reiterates the need to readdress your estate plan every 3 to 5 years, make sure it's doing what you need to do, one, on a personal level, and two, on policy change.
Yeah, that 3 to 5 years I think is really important. And, Bill, you mentioned it, 20 years. We hear that a lot. The will was done when the kids were young. There are the policy and law changes, especially in the areas of the healthcare side of it. We've seen a lot of changes there. Obviously, the Secure Act's a big change. And, that is something to think about in your overall financial picture. So, Bill, Matt, thanks a lot for joining me today. If you have estate planning questions or any questions about your financial plan or your retirement plan, we're here to help. We offer a free 30-minute phone consultation that you can take advantage of. You can call us, or you can visit our website at hilltopwealthsolutions.com. You can schedule your phone consultation online if you wish, but we are here to talk through your financial situation. Next week, we'll have part 2 on our special planning for longer life shows. We'll examine questions about market risk associated with living longer and policy risk as well. How do government policy change your retirement plans? We're out of time for this morning's show. For Bill Davis, Matt Arenz, and the entire Hilltop staff, I'm Erik Brenner. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.